Hi, everybody. Okay, so today we're talking our last market structure type, which is monopolies. If you remember, we've talked all about our market structures so far. So remember, market structure is just how much competition companies face within a certain industry, right? So we can have all the market structures in our economic system, which we do. So we have from the most competition down to the least, we have perfect competition, which has the most amount of sellers, and it's the easiest to get into the market. And remember, that was our growing tomatoes, right? So I can grow tomatoes in my backyard, go sell them at the farmer's market, boom, I'm a tomato farmer, okay? There's a lot of other people that will do it a lot better than me and make a lot more money than me, but I can still do it. Monopolistic competition is, there's a lot of competition in the industry. And it's a little bit more difficult to get into, but still pretty easy. You know, you need money as an investment, right? But not, not a ton of infrastructure. There's not a lot of regulation that's going to stop you from getting into the industry. And then we talked, that was McDonald's, by the way, was our monopolistic competition example. Then we talked oligopoly, which was, where there's like 2 to 4 firms that really dominate an industry. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't others in the industry. It just means that they're dominating others 2 to 4. Our example that we gave there was Verizon Wireless, so cell service companies. We also talked a lot about airlines, and then you watched the WestJet video, which I don't know if you cried. Whenever I show it in class, I always, I don't wear eye makeup that day because I know I'm just going to cry, and kids are always looking at me like, you're right. And then I look over and there's other kids crying too, trying not to, but they're emotional, right? Like, it just makes me happy that they all get their presents and that they didn't know what's happening. And then the guy who got the socks and underwear, he's like, really? Because there's people walking away with flat screen TVs. He's like, I should have known better. So anyway, it's kind of fun. I like that video. So anyway, and then today what we're talking about, which is monopolies, not the board game, although that's fun. It takes forever. So monopoly is when one company dominates an entire industry. And much like oligopolies, it doesn't mean that there's no other company anywhere in the industry, but they certainly do not have anywhere near the market share that the one company does. There's very few monopolies anymore because of advanced technology. And so, you think about DTE Energy is a really good example of a monopoly, right? If you want electricity in your house, you're going through DTE. But nowadays you're like, well, shoot, I can just put solar panels on top of my house, or put a wind turbine in my backyard, or have water power, right? So there are other ways to get to power your home, but DTE covers 99% of the market, right? Who has electricity? Okay. So very few monopolies are allowed anymore. Monopolies are heavily, heavily, heavily regulated by the federal government. Monopolies as a whole, as an idea, I guess, were outlawed or beginning to be regulated, but also outlawed by what's called antitrust legislation. So the Sherman Antitrust Act and several others, although Sherman Antitrust is a big one, Clayton Act is another one, that really said, okay, this is ridiculous. We're not allowing for competition. And the antitrust legislation, we talk about it in a future section, but it started because of companies like Rockefeller Company, right? Standard Oil Group. And they were literally blocking other people from entering. And so, when you can't enter the market, at that time, the investment wasn't as large because there wasn't already the infrastructure built and things. And so it would have made sense then to build infrastructure, but they weren't being allowed to because this other group, company, had the entire market. And we're doing super shady things to block them. All right, so the antitrust legislation came out in the late 1800s, early 1900s. All right, so to be a monopoly, 4 conditions must exist. Remember, all the rest of them had 5. This one only has 4. So there has to be a single seller of whatever the product is. Very, very, very important is number 2, there's no substitutes for that product. They're easily and readily available and make sense. Number 3, entry into the market is extremely difficult, if not impossible. And then number 4, that company has almost complete control over the market price. And that almost has a little asterisk by it because there are laws in place to prevent things like price gouging, right? And price gouging is just like raising and raising and raising and raising and raising a price beyond the point that would make sense for that. Like gas companies, like get gas for your car, not like gas for your home, but and they're not, gas companies are not monopolies, but they have been hit for price gouging a lot. Like they were hit for price gouging during the blackout of 2003. They were hit for price gouging at the beginning of COVID, right, where everybody was like terrified that, oh, what's going to happen? Global pandemic, the power's going to go out. No, but they didn't know if they'd be able to leave their house or, whatever. And if gas companies or gas stations would be open. All right, so example. Oh, DTE Energy, there we go. It's the best one I can always think of here. So remember, we go through like the condition and then how this particular company meets that condition. So the condition of being a single seller, DTE is the only provider of standard electricity services in the Metro Detroit area, which then also includes our area. And I say standard because, again, like you can throw solar panels on your house. You can build wind thingies in your backyard. You can sit there and bike, pedal your water to your house. But if you want standard electricity, it's DTE. So that brings you to no substitutes. If you want electricity, you have to have it through DTE unless you want to create your own energy in some way, shape, or form, which would be very expensive. Right? It is not cheap to like throw a whole bunch of solar panels on your house. It is not cheap, I would expect, to build windmills in your backyard. Like if you look down Range, right by like behind the RISA buildings or Range and 6th Street, they have like all those, the panels, and they were going to build wind things and stuff. But like that's a huge investment. All right, so barriers to entry. Remember, those barriers to entry can be legal barriers to entry. They can be cost prohibitive barriers to entry. In the case of DTE, there's kind of both. So barriers to entry is when, for DTE, it costs an unbelievable amount of money to create the infrastructure necessary to start a utility service. Not only that, it would be creating the technology behind it as well. So not only like building, power lines, and I'm pointing out here because the power lines are out my window. But it's not only building power lines and running the power. It's also like knowing how to do that and having the money to hire people to do that. But on the other side of that, DTE is what's called a natural monopoly. So it's protected by the government. And I'll talk about that. There's like 4 types of monopolies that are acceptable or protected. And so DTE falls under the category of natural monopoly. And so we'll talk about that in a second. All right, and then almost complete control over the price. If you want electricity, you got to pay your DTE bill. Is what it is, right? Your only control that you really have over how much your bill is how much electricity you use. But you don't have any control over what they're going to charge you per whatever they charge by. All right. So barriers to entry for monopolies are a little bit different than for oligopolies. Well, that's not necessarily true. I suppose oligopolies could hit some of these too. But often with monopolies, that like if a monopoly still exists, it's because the government is allowing it to, or because nobody's developed the technology to do it better. So legal barriers are state or federal laws that prevent things like utility companies like DTE from entering the market. And the reason why, it's not that they don't want competition, it's that they know that having competition enter the market will lead to so much ridiculous duplication. So again, to enter the market, and again, I was pointing out here, like there's power lines out here. So if I'm going to become a competitor of DTE in Marysville, I'm going to have to build all those power lines. Well, those already exist. And the amount of power lines that I would have to build, I could probably never make a decent profit off of, how many people I could get to switch from DTE to like Shigley's Electric Company, right? So it doesn't make any sense to build something that's already been built when it covers what's called an economy of scale. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to natural monopoly. But like, it basically just means that it's covering so much of the market that it just simply doesn't make sense to allow anybody else in because they wouldn't be able to make any money. There's monetary barriers. Again, cost of getting started in the business is just too high, right? Building all the power lines is just not cheap. And then there's some instances in which raw materials, like you don't own the raw materials or you can't own the raw materials. There is they don't do commercials anymore, but when I first started teaching econ, they did. And so people would understand when I said a diamond is forever, right? And so De Beers is this company, I believe they're based out of South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. And they have a monopoly on the diamond industry because they've like mined all of this area where most of the world's diamonds are. And so they own something completely ridiculous, like over 90% of the diamond market. So if you're buying a diamond, it doesn't matter who you're buying it from, it's probably originally from De Beers. And so that would be an instance in which you can't own the raw materials because it would involve like purchasing the mines from the De Beers company. All right, so the question here is like, who cares, right? Why do we care if one company dominates an industry? Well, you guys have talked enough about competition and you're smart enough people just in general to know that if there's one company that offers something, then that company can raise prices just forever, right? Unless it, again, goes against like price gouging, right? But they're not gonna, the thing that keeps prices low for most companies is competition, right? It's the fear that if I raise my price too much, then my competitor down the street who offers essentially the same product or what people perceive to be the same product, if they offer it for a bunch less, they're not going to come to me, they're going to go to them. Okay. Now, the difference is like if they think my quality of product is a ton better, or there's like I'm a local business owner and they would prefer to shop local than shop at like a big box store, then, it's a little bit different and they might pay a little bit more. But for the most part, again, like the thing that keeps companies from raising their prices is fear of losing customers. If you don't have a fear of losing customers to anybody, you can just raise your prices as much as you want, right? And then, of course, you're also just stuck. So unless you pay that price, there's literally nowhere else to get that service. And if it's not a necessity, then it's not a big deal. You're like, well, whatever, I can just do without it. But if it is a necessity, that's a huge problem. Like you need electricity, right? And if you don't have it, there's a gajillion things you can't do, including, watch this lecture. So, which is obviously super important. So if you don't have any other choices of where to get this product, that's the problem. Because if they keep raising prices, at some point you might not be able to afford that price, but it is something that you need. Okay, so the question then remains, are monopolies ever okay? And the answer is yes. So there's 4 categories of what we call acceptable monopolies. And acceptable means that like we as consumers have accepted them, the companies have accepted them, like other competitors or would-be competitors have accepted it, and also the government allows it as, kind of like a non-regulated monopoly. So those different types are natural monopoly, geographic, technological, and a government monopoly. All right, so natural monopolies, they exist because they make sense, okay? So this is what I was talking about with DTE, right? So natural monopolies are when it's more efficient or more natural to have just one company providing a good or a service. And again, they're allowed because of this concept called economies of scale. The economy of scale means that they're producing so much that they're able to keep their costs and prices low enough to be acceptable. Maybe not everybody thinks they're super low, but they're low enough. And if somebody else were to get into the market, their startup costs would be so high that they would have to charge way more and probably would not get all of the customers they do because they're charging way more. And so you would end up with this like wasteful duplication that we talked about. So again, like I'm not going to start my own energy company because the cost of building all the infrastructure is so high that in order to make a profit off of it, or to even like reap my costs back, I would have to charge so much. And like DTE, for as much as you think they charge you, I would have to charge you more in the beginning. Okay, so examples here, of course, utilities meaning like electric and gas and that kind of stuff. Bus services and cable television. But the interesting thing is that now technology and innovation are allowing companies to enter the market that essentially offer the same service but in a different way. So like, again, we talked about like the wind power, the solar power for energy. That's pretty expensive. But for bus services, and we don't really live in a place where people take the bus a lot, but in, more of a metro area, more of an urban setting, they do. Well, and the advent of Uber and then Lyft, right? So they come in and they're private companies, and actually, like, they've actually killed the taxi service. Well, not killed it, but they've really had a negative impact on the taxi service in places like Chicago and New York, because taxis are regulated. And the taxi driver, like the yellow taxis, right? They can't change their prices. They can't change that. And so, but Uber can come in or Lyft can come in and say, okay, we're only going to charge you this. So they kind of undercut a little bit. And you can call your own ride. You can schedule them. You can, schedule a car that's going to fit everybody or everything that you have with you. So Uber and Lyft have really done a good job, kind of tailoring to people, like to consumers, whereas, taxi and bus services for so long didn't have any competition at all because they were mostly run by a city, right? Or like some municipality. So then a private company comes in and is like, no, we can do this way better. And it took a little while, but they did. And they're not responsible for buying the fleet of cars like you would be if you owned a taxi service, because everybody who drives for Uber or Lyft drives their own car because they're an independent contractor. So it's like that type of innovation made it such that like bus and taxi services are no longer monopolies in a lot of places. Cable television is another one. So if you want like strict cable television, like actual cable, then your option around here is Comcast. That's it. You could get like I think AT&T or DirecTV or whatever it is, but like, again, that's not cable, it's satellite. And then you could also say, well, I'm not doing cable or satellite. I'm just going to, get streaming services. So I'm going to subscribe to Hulu and HBO Max and Netflix and, all this kind of stuff. So again, innovation and technology has led to some competition, and people innovate when they're sick of the way things are done, right? So Comcast, and like if you're down in Metro Detroit area, you also have WOW. That's another cable company. They were just charging because they were the only game in town, right? And so somebody's like, well, we can do that better. And so they started, creating these other methods of getting almost the same service. So, yeah. All right, the second type is a geographic monopoly. And like the tagline that I put here is not enough profit. So geographic monopoly happens when a company dominates one service area. And again, like you could actually look at DTE for this too, because like they dominate the Metro Detroit area. But if you go over to like the west side of the state or the north side of the state, the DTE isn't there. But what we think about for geographic monopolies are like small towns. So where like it just it just doesn't make any sense to add in another location because there's just not enough customer base for it, right? So these are like small towns, these are freeway exits, like where it's, if you've ever driven to Florida down I-75, there's a lot of places where you're just driving and there's nothing, right? But there's like a couple places where you get off the freeway and you can like get McDonald's and get gas and get a hotel. And a lot of times, that's all that's there, right? And the thing with geographic monopolies is that usually businesses can enter the market, but they choose not to because the profit margin is so small. So there is in a place called Reading, Michigan, which is like down here somewhere. So it's where my husband grew up, and his mom still lives there. And it is like this teensy tiny little town out in the country. He graduated, I think, with like 40 people in his graduating class. It's a really small town. And she has to drive 10 miles to get to the grocery store. So she has to drive 10 miles to get to Walmart. And usually, like if you drive, like mentally, you take a drive up 25, right, to the north end of town, to the mall, right, that area. So there's a Kroger on your way there for a grocery store. There's Country Sound Market, which is a specialty grocery store. You keep going, there's Target, where you can get some grocery stuff. There's Aldi on the left. I don't know if they've reopened yet, but they were. And then if you go out further, you'll hit Meijer, and then you'll hit Walmart. So within that, like, 2-mile stretch of road, there's like 5 grocery stores. Okay. She has to travel 10 miles to get to Walmart, and there's not another grocery store for another probably 10-mile radius. And it's because, like, Walmart got there, and Meijer's like, well, we could open, but there's just not enough people, right? There's not enough people to split that customer base. Like, neither one of them would make money at that point. The geographic monopolies, kind of for the most part, are declining because you can order whatever you want on the internet, right? So again, like if you were in a small town and you only had, a couple of options for stuff, you could purchase everything else you need on Amazon or whatever else it is, right? Whatever website you need. All right, a technological monopoly is the third kind, and the tagline here is, that's my invention, right? So a technological monopoly is if you invent something, you're given, well, you have to, you have to apply for and get a patent for it. And if you have a patent, you have exclusive rights to manufacture or sell that product or whatever it is for 20 years. Or if it's like a creative thing, like writing, book or a song or something like that, or a show or some other art, you have a copyright on it. But that's usually for 70 years. And then after that, people can just buy your catalogs from you if you don't buy them yourself. There's a very famous story about Michael Jackson, who was given advice by Paul McCartney, who is was in the Beatles. And so it had like this tremendous collection of work, but the producer was going out of business. I think it was Apple Productions, not the same Apple, but like a different company. And so Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson were odd friends. And so Michael Jackson asked him for some advice, in investing and stuff. And Paul McCartney said, like, you should buy people's music, right? And then you can kind of do what you want with that. You can sell it to commercials, you could do whatever. And Michael Jackson's like, that sounds like a good idea. And so then the Beatles catalog went up for sale. And Michael Jackson outbid Paul McCartney for his own music. So Paul McCartney is the one who gives him this advice, like, you should buy music. Michael Jackson's like, cool, thanks, I'll do that. And then he goes and buys Paul McCartney's music. Like, that's shady. So they were not friends anymore. And Paul McCartney's still around. Obviously, Michael Jackson has passed away, but it created a bit of a rift in their relationship there. So anyway, examples here, your iPhone, your Keurig coffee maker, music, art, Polaroid. I think your book gives like the George Foreman grill as an example. So, but the thing is that we all know, like, something gets invented, a knockoff is right there, right? So, like you used to have to buy like Apple chargers and Apple cases and stuff for your phone, and now other companies are making them. They've just like figured out like exactly how to fit them. And so you don't have to pay $40 for the charger anymore. You can pay $10, right? This was the most recent example with Apple, I believe, would be the AirPods. So Apple comes out with AirPods, and I think they range anywhere from like $150 to $300, depending on like which cool AirPods you get. But you can also get things that look exactly like AirPods for like $16.99 at Best Buy or Target or wherever. It's probably not gonna, like, I don't know, maybe they're not the same, maybe the quality's not as good, maybe they won't last as long, or the battery's lower, what have you. But like a knockoff is there, right? Because people understand like when a popular product exists on the market. So people who are other inventors of other things see Apple and they're like, they're super popular and they're super expensive. So I bet we can do the same kind of thing for less. All right, and then the last one is government monopoly. So these are what we call public goods. And it's literally, as you might expect, a monopoly held by the government. So the thing is here, you can't enter the market because it's not a private industry. It's sort of similar to a natural monopoly in that the goal of it is efficiency. And the goal of it is meeting regulation too. So most infrastructure, it's like roads, bridges, and waterways, and parks and whatnot are government monopolies. Now, whether they're federal level or they could be down to the local level. But like Marysville City Park is a government monopoly. All of the roads here are government monopolies, meaning I can't just like build a road, right? Like that's the government's job to do that. As a private citizen, I can't build a road without asking permission to do that. So the government will build roads and they'll use private companies to build them, but you'll have like, there's rules in place for bidding that out. So that, you know, so that the government can just like hire the same people all the time, or like, you know, cut corners and hire like shady companies and that kind of thing. So if you're a construction company and you're hired to work on like I-94, you're hired by the state of Michigan to do that. All right. Was that it? Oh, it is. Yay. So there you go. We've went through all the market structures. So know the difference between them, and remember the major difference between them is the amount of competition they face. And then the second major difference is how hard it is to get into the industry. So monopolies face the least amount of competition and it's hardest to get into the industry if you can at all. And then perfect competition is the most amount of competition, easiest to get into the industry. And then monopolies and oligopolies fall in between. Oligopolies, less competition than monopolistic competition. And then like it kind of goes like there's a correlation, right? So like the less amount of competition you face, the harder it is to get into the industry. The more amount of competition you face, the easier it is to get into the industry, which makes sense, right? So like, because the reason why a monopoly is a monopoly is because it's very difficult to get into the industry. So like that should like resonate with you a little bit. Okay, so no homework tonight because it's a Friday, so thank you very much. And we'll look at an article about government monopolies on Monday. All right, have a good weekend. Goodbye. Well, I always say goodbye before I stop recording, and then there's another one. Okay, now goodbye.